Welcome to Your Next Tech Startup. I'm Isabel Rasmussen, host and founder of Proceso Talent. Today, I have Mark Roddy on with me. Mark and I have both spent a lot of time interviewing engineers to explore if the startup that we're helping build, if they're a good fit for it. And so we thought it would be an interesting conversation to talk about the type of engineers who do thrive at a startup and kind of what that takes. Hopefully, from this conversation, for engineers who haven't had the opportunity to be at an early stage startup, this allows them to kind of think more about that and determine if they will thrive in that environment. So, Mark, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me, Isabel.
Thank
So I'm
you.
a fractional VP of engineering. I work with early stage startups to deal with sort of non-technical engineering leadership issues. And, one of the biggest ones there is recruiting. And so I think that we have, between the two of us, we've got a lot of insights to share.
Yes. And yes, we're both fractionals and I'm so excited that we connected. So, let's start with that person who doesn't have that early stage startup experience. And why are some of the reasons that people think that they would want to be at a startup, which are maybe not the actual experience of being at a startup?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions. And to speak specifically, so I work with early stage pre-product market fit startups. So pre
Mhm.
everything is exploding because it's going so well, and that sort of famous hockey stick graph, the first half of that hockey stick before it's gone up into the right. And that is a very particular environment with very particular constraints. And I think people get confused in the distinction between those two. They are very different environments. A growth stage startup is more like a public company than it is a pre-product market stage. But yet we call both these sort of stages startups. And so I think that creates some confusion of like what you should actually expect. As far as like the specific misconceptions that people have, one is that like I'm going to make a lot of money, and that that future possibility exists. The likelihood is actually not that high. Most startups fail, and that's a reality. And so, um, if what you're looking for is money, there are actually way better options. Even within the tech industry writ large, there are way better ways to make a lot of money than a early stage startup that's actually going to underpay you to begin with.
Is one that I don't hear, but I mean, I guess when they're talking with me, they're interviewing and you were saying that like you hear that one more just as like in conversation. And also I think really great to call out like we are really talking about joining an early stage startup when you're possibly one of the first five, first 10
Mhm,
engineers. And that's
mhm.
where you and I spend a lot of our kind of our time. So yeah, so it is a different experience. I've been in mid to late stage. There are a couple other ones that, are the kind of the misconceptions around like why join an early stage startup.
I think a lot of people think that as an engineer, they're going to get to a blank slate, and that's going to result in them doing a lot of deep technical work, that they're sort of going to be able to like go put their heads down for weeks at a time to just build all the stuff because there's so much stuff to build. And it's true that there's so much stuff to build, but actually most startups are much more interested in iterating quickly and
Yeah.
going down and coming back up quickly. And there's also a lot of work to do that is not like sort of deep technical work, that is not like I'm thinking really hard. There's a lot of minutia.
Yeah.
Not only does the product not exist yet, but every single supporting thing around building a product doesn't exist yet. You're sort of doing a lot of what I almost call janitor work. And some people actually, if what you want is lots of deep technical work, that might actually be very off-putting. Some people love this sort of strong variety in their work, but if what you want is to be very focused on a very small number of things, you're actually going to
Yeah.
probably struggle.
Yeah. Most of those things that you've called out, I've like recently had conversations with co-founders. One really on the like, you know, just get it out, get it done fast, and then you get
Hmm.
feedback and then you iterate. Like
Yep.
they don't want that person who wants all that time to go and ponder.
Hmm. Mhm.
And that's actually, I'm like pushing candidates on that right now as I'm interviewing. And then I
Mhm.
have another founder who, and both of these companies are in the AI space. And that founder has said to me, like, I don't want an engineer who just wants to do cool AI stuff. Like, you've got to just have to do it all.
Mhm.
You might be doing really boring work for a bit, and you've got to be okay with that. So, yeah, hearing what you say is exactly what I hear from founders as like frustrations for I think people that, haven't been the best hires for them.
In a similar vein, there's something I hear from mid-career to senior folks that is a misconception I hear a lot, that people who have experience, people who are capable and sort of have been around the block once or twice, maybe even, I think even more likely, they've been around the block at a later stage startup. They've
Mhm.
seen what happens several years down the line after all that pre-product market fit stuff. And they see what they see is a mess. They see lots of technical debt. They see systems that are difficult to work with, that don't feel sort of fully thought out. They feel very duct taped on top of each other. I don't know if you've ever been to like a college campus in an urban environment where they grow and grow and grow, but they can't grow coherently. And so there's like, to get to the fourth floor of the gym, you have to go to the second floor and then go to the other side of the building and then take an elevator up one floor and then go to the middle of the building and then go. I don't know if you've ever been in a building like that, but this is how a lot of engineers will describe the technology
Mhm.
they work on day to day at sort of um, a later stage, maybe pre-exit, but probably
Yeah.
post-exit stage. And I see folks who have had that experience, and they have this thought of, "I won't do that. I won't
Right. I'll
create that
build it
mess.
better.
I'm gonna do it right the first time."
Yeah.
And this is a definitely a misconception. Doing it right the first time is a lot more work. Doing it right the first time is a lot more time consuming. And for startups, especially at this early stage, time is the biggest asset that they have. It's so little of it. And what they want to do is, like you said about other founders you've talked to, get something out there and see if it works, see if
Yeah.
people, if it resonates, see if anybody cares. I don't care about doing it right.
So
Doing right is finding out someone cares about it.
so this is one that I do hear more, is that kind of like, yeah, like building it right. Like, well, if you're building too fast, like what about tech debt? Like all of those things. So I'm wondering, is I guess the right engineer, which, like, let's move into that kind of like who's the right engineer. It's
Mhm.
like they're not worrying so much about the tech debt. I mean, yes, I get like that sucks later on.
Mhm.
So there's that, like, oh God, all the tech debt answers that I get from engineers, which I've, up until talking to you right now, I was like, oh, that's a very valid concern, because I've been at those mid and late stage and heard all those like
Mhm.
conversations about the horrible
Mhm.
tech debt. But like really the right answer is the product, and needing to get the product in front
Mhm.
of the customer as quickly as
Mhm.
possible. And so that product minded engineer versus that, and I don't want to say those are two different people, the tech debt concerned engineer and the product concerned engineer, but maybe I don't write code, you do. So like, are those sometimes the same person? I think they are.
It could be. So I think an important thing, the word you used, hindsight.
Mhm.
In hindsight, all this stuff is more complicated than it needs to be. All of it is sort of shakily ascended in a way that's shaky and not on a solid foundation. Uh, in hindsight, it is. The If you had been there in the beginning, what you would actually see is the thing that's a shaky foundation right now was maybe the 20th product in 2 years. If the
Mhm.
first 19 products had been built with a solid foundation, well, you wouldn't have built 19 products. You built three, and you would have
Right,
never gotten to the 20th successful one.
right. You wouldn't have gone through your next rounds because
Exactly.
you wouldn't do milestones.
So in hindsight, it's very easy to say, like, well, if we had done it this way, but no one would have ever done it that way. Like
Right.
that would not have
Yeah,
happened. If someone had chosen to do it that way, they never actually would have gotten to that successful
right.
inflection point.
Yeah.
Um, and
That's
so to
like
your
me
question, no,
thinking, oh, I was gonna say that's like me thinking that I just always want a time machine so I can make better stock investments.
well, to your question
So
of Can the
Yeah.
person afraid of technical debt be the product
Okay.
minded person? I think the big question is, can they appreciate that point? Can they appreciate that,
Okay.
hey, even though the right decision to make right now to embrace technical debt, to embrace short term thinking, to embrace short term engineering design, even though that's sort of the optimal decision right now, and you know it will create problems down the road, are you okay executing on that?
Right. If you're
If
not,
you,
you shouldn't join an early stage startup.
yep.
Okay. And let's move into that. We're really talking about mindset. What is the right mindset for someone? Or I like to talk about it as being happy. Are you going to be happy at a startup? Because I
Mhm.
always say, I don't want to recruit you into a role that you're not going to be happy in. Obviously, with happiness comes productiveness.
You do your best work when you're comfortable with the work you're doing.
Yeah.
When it feels less like work, you're always doing your best work when you're in an environment that
Yeah.
feels aligned with you and how you do things.
For people who are thinking through that. And if early stage startup is like just being really honest with yourself. And it's something that when I interview, I do try to kind of push people on. I see that you're hesitant there. Is that really what you want?
Mhm.
Like pushing them. So, in that, the people that you have found to, after they're hired, that are the happiest in those early stage startups, what are the things that they exhibited early on?
Well, there's one we sort of touched on earlier, which is the do you want to the deep technical folks, the people who are the opposite, who are like, I like my job to change every day. One day
Mhm.
I'm writing a product feature. One day I'm trying to figure out why the deployed failed. One day I'm talking to a customer, trying to better understand why they don't understand the UI components that we had built, and they were very confused
Yeah.
and clicked in the wrong place. One day I'm doing this. One day I'm doing that.
Yeah.
Some
Well,
people like
and
to be focused, and some people like to jump around. And the more you like to jump around, the more successful you will be because there's a
yeah,
lot to jump around to.
what you're calling out right there is how you and I connected because you had written that
Mhm,
in like a kind of a dialogue on LinkedIn.
mhm,
And you had said it's one thing to wear a lot of hats over 2 years, it's
mhm,
another to wear
mhm.
like multiple hats in one day or in one week. I think that's such a important distinction.
And the root of that is that when you say, I'm talking about people who like to change what they're doing. I want to do this thing and then I want to do another thing. And a timeline component is important there. I know lots of people who will be a security engineer at a FANG for 6 months and then go work on front end code and then go work on a mobile app and then go work on infrastructure. They enjoy getting that change of venue and sort of that different experience,
Mhm.
but they don't do it daily. They like go and do a project or two. They work on a team for 6 months, for a year, and then they move on to something wildly different. And that's great that they've both realized that about themselves and found a place to do that. At a startup, though, like your timelines are compressed. You
Yeah,
can't work on product features for a year and then say, now it's time to work on the deploy. Um,
right.
this is all stuff that has to happen today. And if you don't like that sort of context switch, I think you'll probably have a much harder time.
All right, working through a little technical difficulty. So we were talking about people who are successful in early stage startups.
Mhm.
And, what's another kind of identifier of those who typically do really well?
So I like this phrase, people who do dishes as they cook. And sort of this comes back to cook for yourself or your family. Do
Mhm.
you wait till the very end to start doing dishes and find a massive pile of dishes? Or in the 5 minutes in between when you put something in the oven and you have to stir a pot, do you grab three of the dishes and scrub them off real quick and put them in the washer and be done with them? It's sort of doing things as you go, and being able to multitask. I've got a really great example of this of an engineer I worked with who was really frustrated with his employer's CI system. And I understand why. They essentially had none, and he was flying by the seat of his pants. There had been multiple outages, and he just wanted some feedback. He wanted to know, did I break everything? That was really reasonable. The problem was his only proposal was to stop doing any feature work for 6 weeks. And the founders just flat no, that's not, we have so much feature work to do. We can't stop doing that for 6 weeks. My advice to him was, in that 6 weeks, there's probably multiple 1 day efforts you can make to improve the situation. Um, do those first. As you're building these features, and take 1 day up front to sort of get something initial set up, and then just add to it as you go along. Um, this gentleman, he couldn't do that. The only way he understood how to do it was to put down one type of work and pick up another type of work. And so I think people who are okay with um, sort of doing more than one thing at a time, who are
Yeah,
okay
it
with,
goes back to what you were talking about with the wear multiple hats, and it's that
mhm,
yeah.
mhm,
Are there any ones that you can think of? Like, I talked about the product-minded engineer versus that
mhm.
one. So, would you say that I do it based on the founders and what they're looking for, but do you think to be successful at an early stage startup, you have to really care about the product and be more product minded than more like, what's the coolest tech I get to work on? Is that a
um,
distinguisher?
I think it is absolutely a distinguisher. One thing about the way you phrased it, do you have to? And I would say for any of these, it's not a question of do you have this characteristic? It's how many of these characteristics do you have? And there's like a bunch of other
Right.
sort of characters we can talk to. And how much do you feel them like in your core? Like there are people who if they have to focus on one type of technical work for more than a week, get frustrated. That person dropped into a startup is going to thrive because that's going to be the environment where they do their best work. If you're the kind of person who's like, I want to do a month at a time, um,
Right.
you might still be able to be successful the
Yeah.
more successful you be. And so, do you need to be product minded? Not necessarily, and sort of not all startups the same. And some startups need people who are heavily technical minded and can focus on some things.
Mhm.
Um, but the more you care about the users and your product's impact on them versus the inherent value of the technology you've built, the more successful you will be, the more you will thrive.
Okay, so a little bit of technical difficulty, but the last thing that I think would love to talk about because I hear it all the time. I feel like every startup that I've recruited for probably talks about ambiguity
Mhm.
and comfort around ambiguity. Let's dive a bit into why that's so important.
Um, Sort of the very quick TLDR is there's so much of it,
Mhm,
especially relative to other places you may work in the tech industry. Um, if you are at sort of Apple or other, especially if you're in hardware, you know what you're doing in a year and a half. The timelines are so long.
mhm,
Um, at a startup, you literally may not know what you're doing at the end of the week. You just might. And if something you need to sort of be productive is to know that, and some people need that. Some people struggle if they don't know what they're going to be doing a week from now, 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now. It makes decision making difficult because they don't know what the impact of their decisions is going to be in their own, and that makes it harder to make decisions. Uh,
Ending on a happy note of
mhm.
what are the things that when we're talking about thrive at a startup, like what are the great things about thriving at a startup?
um, My number one thing I pitch to people for why you should go work at a startup is experience compression.
Mm,
2 years of a pre-product market fit startup is the same experience as 5 years at a late stage startup is the same experience as 10 years at a established company. There is so much work to do and it has so much variety. You will get so much exposure to many things. You will get so many opportunities. At that 25-year-old public company, they're not going to give you the reins on day one. They're not going to give you the reins on year three. They're going to
mhm,
make you quote unquote prove yourself, which is a long, arduous journey. Um, at a startup on day one, like he was supposed to be the second front end developer, but the first one quit, was not working out. Um,
mhm.
And so he inherited a code base and it didn't do what he needed to do. And there was a demo the next week and they said, there's a half finished product. Can you finish it? This is on day one. And he did. And he
Yeah.
was stressed and it was a lot of work, but he told me it was one of the most fulfilling experiences of his career.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think that's a great thing to call out. If you can be comfortable in those spaces and you're looking for that opportunity to wear multiple hats on one day and really grow your career, the early stage startups can be a huge opportunity. I think another thing we haven't talked about is collaboration
Mhm,
and the ability to be on a small team. Some of my closest relationships, how big was the engineering team? Maybe 30 to 40. The engineers who were on that team, my son was a year old at that time. He's 9 now, so quite a while ago. Those are the people who I still like talk with and text with. We're
mhm,
friends like throughout all this time. They're on other episodes. And so you really do get to build these like really incredible relationships with that. And I
mhm.
also see, when you go in early on at a startup, you know, as startups continue to grow and funding cycles get complicated and things like that, layoffs are oftentimes part of being at mid to late stage startups. Sometimes I noticed that those core early engineers, because they have such a strong relationship with the founders, they're the ones who, if 20% of the team get let go, they're not touched. Also, if that startup fails, oftentimes those are the engineers that are recruited to the founder's next startup.
A sort of, I think a little more positive example of that dynamic is being the engineer that the CEO goes to, even though there's 5 levels of the reporting chain between you 2.
Mm,
Having access, like, you will always have that access to those people if you stay with that organization in the long term.
right.
Um, some people, what they do with that access is they move up the ranks. They become they enter the leadership ranks themselves. Some people don't want to do that. There's a level of prestige when you're an individual contributor that this 2,000 person company that the CEO walks up to your desk to ask your opinion on something. That this is the only way I have seen anyone get that type of prestige, that type of trust between someone at the very top and, an individual contributor.
Yeah. No, that's such a great point. So thank you so much for joining me today and sharing all of these incredible insights you've had through your career. And hopefully it'll help some engineers figure out if, another startup or an earlier stage startup is, or a first time joining a startup is the right fit for them. Thank you.
Oh, this was a ton of fun, and I appreciate you me having on, and can't wait to do it again.